System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Today is Thursday, April 10th. I am Amin TMK alongside Emoja Lil Tanky Sumler. Hello, Tanky, my good friend. How are you doing on this fine Thursday?
Man, much better than the stock market. So,
wow.
Dun, dun, dun.
Wow, we really got that in sync. Let's talk about some fun things that are going on here in America. Like you mentioned, stock market going down. Way down in the hole. If you're a Wire fan, you understand what I'm saying here. But there's a tariff war. That's the whole thing everyone's talking about, right? So here's my question to you. Because I'm not that smart. I'm just a person who follows the news. China seems to have us beat in quite a lot of areas, and that's certainly production capacity. So when you impose a tariff on, and we've heard people in the Trump administration say as high as 400% is what they would want. You put these tariffs on a country in which you import mostly from them. They don't really export from you. They don't even really buy that many goods from you anymore. And that's only getting less and less. If I put these tariffs in and they are making all of our things more expensive and essentially ending the relationship between Chinese consumerism and American products, isn't that bad?
So one thing I would say real quick, just to adjust your expectation, if the Chinese truly didn't buy that much from Americans, the exposure wouldn't be that bad. You get what I'm saying? But it's not true. There are more Starbucks in China than there are in America, right? Buick is the number one car brand the number one American car brand in China. How about this? Way more Buicks get sold in China than get sold in America. You know what I'm saying? And they're seen as a luxury vehicle. You know, Buick in China is looked at the way we look at like a Mercedes, a well-built foreign, big body, you know what I'm saying? V8, right? So like these are things that will be hurt because when China put their reciprocal tariffs, those things now cost more. You know, that's the dark side of protectionism. Protectionism works if you the person that has the most to sell and everyone has to buy your stuff. You know, maybe it would have worked in the 90s. Maybe. I don't think it ever did, though. I don't think that kind of warfare works. But what do you expect, right? This is actually Trump thinking that he is in his lane. You know, Wharton Business School. He sees, in his own mind, he sees himself as like anti-war in the traditional sense, right? That's not to say that he's not bloody. That's not to say that he hasn't done his things. Most of the things that he's done and the way that he rationalizes things doesn't count because he hasn't done them to European countries, right? This is, again, the big problem with him in the Ukrainian-Russian war. He doesn't want to see white nations fighting each other, But in some ways, you could even argue that he's not anti-war, but he prioritizes economic war, right? People still die, but they don't die from bombs. They die from famine. They die from not getting their medicine, right? Those kind of things. It's kind of a neoliberal way of looking at war. But the thing to remember about Trump that nobody wants to acknowledge is he's a New York Democrat. He came up in that whole system, that Manhattan Democrat system, kicking it with Hillary Clinton, kicking it with Bill Clinton. You know what I'm saying? Like, he only recently became a Republican within the last 15 years of his political reimagination of self, right? And so, like, these are still kind of neoliberal ways to do things. In his mind, right, especially with all of the state of the American military. And what I mean by that is its level of readiness to engage in like a big war against a peer adversary. It's not quite there. It's bomb, it's missiles, it's munitions, all of the artillery. It's at an all-time low because all of it's been diverted for so long to both Israel, right, and Ukraine, that they don't have the numbers that they want. And so to him, since they can't go to physical war with China, and it's not his preferable way of engaging in war anyway, he chooses economic warfare. And that's what you're seeing with these tariffs, where he tariffs the world, right? And he takes it all back and only leaves the tariffs on China. You know, I saw on the internet, it's a terrible joke, but it's true. The Americans decided to have a math war with the Asians. Like, work it the fuck out, man. Like, you're not as smart as you think you are. And like, that's what's showing up in the stocks. Yeah, Monday, China's stock their Wall Street, there was a little bit of fluctuation. It didn't look bad. It didn't look good, but it didn't close, the way that several other stock brokers around the world could not open, you know what I'm saying, or had to halt trading. That did not happen in China. It was a hit, and then the rumors came out, and me and you discussed this, right? Like, what happened immediately with all that stock fluctuation? Treasury started getting sold. Treasury started getting sold all around the world, right? It was affecting the American bond expectation, which is a big deal because that's how countries get loans for themselves. They put those stock bonds, they put those treasury yields out, right? But the rumor was it was China. Come to find out, it was just the average speculator, the average person that holds treasuries, because the market was spooked. Like, they just didn't know what to do, and they wanted to trade those treasuries out for commodities they trusted more, probably gold. But probably, it went whatever you believe in. Gold would have went up. After a little bit of fluctuation, probably people went into Bitcoin. All of those other secondary or tertiary ways that you try to save money. That's what happened. And the rumor was it was the Chinese, but it wasn't. It was just the regular investors. And what China did was essentially they put retaliatory, tariffs on the Americans, and they called their bluff. And this is a dangerous thing because economic warfare is still warfare, and we need to acknowledge this. And the Americans are quite adept at using economic warfare in ways where Americans don't think about it. Like, again, it's the duty of Congress to declare war, right? Even an economic war. But that's not what's happened. You have the president ruling by fiat and making these determinations about who's going to get what. And again, these are the kind of things that normally Congress handles. I just want to give two quotes as it relates to economic war, right? So look at Sun Tzu. This, again, demonstrates how Americans use economic war quite well. Sun Tzu suggests using the enemy's resources as an effective way to avoid depleting one's economic and financial resources, right? So what did you see happen with these proxy wars, right? They're trying to get, the enemy to use their resources fighting someone, not them. Right. So this is a very clever way of reading Sun Tzu instead of, the Napoleonic way where you invade Russia and you take these cities away from them and they're not able to use the resources. You force the enemy to use the resources on someone, not you. Right. And those resources are being used on Ukraine. The same way the Americans are depleted, the Russians have lower stockpiles than they would normally have. But the thing to remember is, once again, Russia's output, they're out competing the West. They're building, so even though their stores are down, it doesn't matter because they're still producing more ammunition than the West combined, the NATO forces combined. When you're talking about, so you know what I'm saying? That's what they're trying to do. The second quote I'll leave you with is why war happens. And this is called the economic theory of war, right? And it was the Journal of Politics in the University of Chicago back in the day. You can look this up. And what they hypothesized was war happens when it's expected to produce a gain in economic efficiency large enough to make the expected outcome of fighting better than the continuation of an inefficient peace. You see what I'm saying? So like they're using this economic war now because to them, this is right instead of how much it'll cost them to start losing aircraft carriers, which will definitely happen if you're fighting China, instead of losing these incredibly expensive F-35s, which will happen if you fight China. They're instead trying to offset that in a way where it's more financially advantageous. And that is what they're doing with these tariffs. So long answer, but you asked a really tough question. So I just really wanted to break it down, man.
We've seen Pete Hegseth, as you call him, Pete Hegsworth. God wills it.
Oof.
Infidel.
Right.
We've seen him just come back from the Panama Canal. A lot of incendiary rhetoric coming down from that area as he comes back here to talk to Trump. Do you see Panama and the Panama Canal? So, we go back. Obviously, there was the Hong Kong company that was holding the major stake to BlackRock, and the Chinese government nixed it. And Pete Hegseth goes down to Panama, and he's saying, we're working it out. China's not going to have any influence here. They didn't build the canal. Do you kind of see, first, what are your thoughts on that? And also, do you see the Panama Canal as sort of a flashpoint?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's meant to be a choke point. You have to understand that all of this is about trade. All of it. And so trade doesn't just miracle from China to the United States or from America to Brazil or from Brazil to fucking Lisbon. It has to get there, right? And so there are several maritime choke points in the world that can really effectively cripple your ability to do commerce. We have, of course, the Suez Canal, which is a major energy flashpoint. More than a third of the world's energy goes through the Suez Canal. So that's a choke point. The Panama Canal is one of the largest canals as far as like manufacturing goods and such. So like that's a flashpoint, right? Because if you cut that off, what you're doing is effectively you're making one less way for European goods to get to Asia or for Asian goods to get to Europe. Okay. Or America for that matter, or any person on the other side of that canal. There are a couple of other choke points. There is the Pass of Magellan, which is notoriously one of the most dangerous waterways in the world, so that's not really something where you want cargo ships, going through fucking Tierra del Fuego. You don't want that. Only recently have the Arctic routes come open, but most of those are controlled by Russia. Some of them are controlled by Denmark by way of controlling Greenland, which is why, again, that's a place where the Americans are trying to get. And some of it is controlled a little bit by Canada and the United States, but not very much. Not by way of area, right? But simply the American and the Canadian infrastructure hasn't really utilized the kind of nuclear grade icebreakers it takes to keep those routes through the Arctic carved and reliable. Nobody wants, their cargo ship getting froze at the North Pole, right? So right now, it's much easier to trust the Russian route. So that's not something the Americans control, but they're trying to offset that by controlling Greenland. But so like those are the major choke points in the world. And a quick one that's not quite as important, but is important, is the Malacca Straits, which is in Indonesia, right? It essentially cuts off petroleum routes through the ocean that would be going to China or Chinese goods that, once again, might be going to any other place, probably Europe or Africa or the Middle East, right? And especially if the Panama Canal is gone, you have to go through the Malacca Straits. So just looking at these things geographically, the Panama Canal is incredibly important. The thing that I don't think the Americans are game planning against, right? To them, it's like, can I seize the canal? Which I think undoubtedly they can, right? Not legally, but legalism doesn't stop, fucking aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. And we have to, once again, this is what the liberal mind doesn't understand, is the capacity to use force becomes its own justification often, right? The United States is able to do the thing. And so they probably will. If they had to do it, they probably would. Could the Chinese force a fight in the Panama Canal that they could defeat the American Navy? I think that's incredibly unlikely. I think if the Americans chose to militarize that canal, if they wanted to shut it down to Chinese vessels, they absolutely could. But I think in that scenario, first off, China already has several economic outs. They've been working with Mexico and Sheinbaum to move products directly across Mexico. So you can go then from the Pacific Ocean to the Baja of California, across Mexico, and then once again have access to the Caribbean and then the Atlantic. It's not as fast, but it's a contingency. And of course, there's the deep water port they made in Bogota, right, where the things go directly across South America. Again, even slower, but it doesn't really matter so much because one of your biggest clients is not Europe isn't the only country you do business with. Brazil, a BRICS country, that gives you direct access to Brazil without utilizing the Panama Canal. And there's always the Muad'Dib option, right? He who can control a thing, he who can destroy a thing controls a thing. And that means to say, though I don't think the Chinese could wrest it away militarily from the United States, there's nothing preventing them from just fucking destroying it. And now nobody can use it. That is within their power. That's not impossible. That's not the world's most difficult military objective. Now, holding it open, that's significantly harder. And I just don't see any scenario where they can outduel the American Navy essentially in their own backyard. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. So the Chinese have made contingencies, as in almost all things, just like they did for the economic war when they, put their retaliatory tariffs back on the Americans.
Yeah. And, they've been doing a lot of military drills around Taiwan. This is one of the biggest last week. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what those military drills were? And, do you see it again as just another sign of inevitable escalation?
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned on Inner City Left quite a lot, and we cannot state this enough. People keep talking about we're very close to World War III. That's wrong. We're in World War III. It's just a low intensity part, relatively low intensity speaking, unless you're a fucking Palestinian, it's not low intensity at all, unless you're a Syrian and it's not low intensity at all, right? Ukrainian, right? Russian, it's not right. But for the rest of the world, it's been relatively painless. Some prices went up, inflation got bad, gas is hot but it can go the other way, right? Like, so when you're talking about what's happening with China, they're representing the ability to project physical force to take this to another level. They're once again saying to the Americans, as mighty as you are, as powerful as you are, even Superman can't be everywhere. If you choose to start a war with Iran, which, by the way, full BRICS partner, which means that China is invested in their economic growth. They're invested in China's economic growth. And let's be honest, as much as anything, the Americans want to damage Iran, not just as a fidelity to their relationship with their client state, Israel, but also because Iran is one of the largest petroleum producers for Russia. For China, right? So if you were to damage that, that's one less source of energy coming into China. Once again, that's part of that economic strategy of not having to fire a direct shot. And China recognized it immediately for what it is. It understands that if you're here to attack Iran, you're trying to indirectly attack us by crippling, China's ability to have the power it needs to power its industry. Right? Again, it always goes back to the dollars. So what did they do? They immediately blockaded Taiwan, ostensibly under, we just practicing, making sure. But the message was loud and clear, and everybody that follows these kind of things recognized it immediately. They're saying, if you go to war with Iran right now, we'll just take Taiwan, because you can't do both. You can't go to war with Iran. First off, Iran is much tougher than you think it's going to be. It's not Iraq. You're not going to go in there and just change. We've talked about that a lot on the show. And they're betting the Americans are not good enough to be able to go into Iran in an effective way and also be able to reliably continue to both arm the Israelis, arm the Ukrainians, and arm the Taiwanese. They're saying, you go for Iran, we're just going to go ahead and solidify with Taiwan because it'll be our best opportunity. Again, this is a kind of calculus that just didn't exist in the world before multipolarism. The United States could threaten anybody. They could go anywhere, Even under the quote-unquote Cold War with the Russians, ultimately, over a long enough timeline, America proved there was nowhere they wanted to go that the Soviets couldn't keep them from going. There was almost no objective they wanted to achieve the Soviets couldn't prevent them from achieving. And that's really no greater tell of that than the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the end of the day, they weren't able to get rid of Castro, but they were, that's a secondary, tertiary objective. The real objective was make sure there are no nuclear missiles that are close enough to hit the United States, because that is ultimately the greatest advantage that the Americans have when it comes to geopolitical calculations as it relates to war. Very few of you can hit America. America can hit almost all of you. And some of you, it can hit at the same time. But Iran and China, very difficult. Fighting any one of those alone would be difficult. Fighting both in a hot war, I just don't see it. Unless there's some super weapon that's been waiting.
No, it's insanity.
Right.
I get you have such a great, military mind. Here's the logistics. Here's what it is. But no, it's insanity. What's happening is not possible. It's not going well for you. It's not going well for you in Yemen. It's going bad for you in Yemen. It's going bad for your production capacity and what you have, the ability to go to war with Iran. You don't have that ability. You don't have that ability to be everywhere at once because China isn't. They can say whatever they want about China and Africa and China and in Latin America. Is the military there? Oh, no. But AFRICOM exists. Oh, there's U.S. There's ops all in South America and Central America. So, again, maybe you should look at your own country before we're ready to have this conversation about China's exploitative nature. Ask yourself, does America do this? And if they do this, do they do this worse? So, again, it is not possible. It's not in the benefit of humanity at all in any capacity. And all I hear now is the new, and I feel like it's getting ramped up. Obviously, that's why I wanted to talk about it today. But you hear about it in every news source. Well, China, they're a bunch of cheaters. They're a bunch of liars. They're stealing. It's just racism. That xenophobia is just right back here in the United States, and the American people just falling right into it.
Right. When they say that the Chinese are stealing from the Americans at this point, they mean truly ideas. Because America doesn't conceptually have any of the shit made, right?
They don't even know what they're talking about.
Oh, the Chinese made 6G before we did. They stole our idea, right? But they didn't steal your blueprints because you don't have no fucking blueprints. You know what I'm saying? Like this is the thing that the American people need to understand when we say that China is ahead of the Americans in several key technologies, right? We're just not used to that. We're used to the American technology being the best everywhere. And if it's not, maybe Germany has slightly better technological, oh my God, the German, combustion engine is slightly more advanced than the American. Oh my God, maybe the Japanese.
What we talk about with the 100-round drum thing, like you have a gun with a 100-round drum. Why don't you just have more people with guns?
There it is.
Who would win? One person with a 100-round drum? Or 15 people, or let's just say 4 people with a rifle. At some point, the wowie zowie doesn't matter. What matter is logistics, manpower, production capability. And I'm sorry, the Houthis have already destroyed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of these fancy schmancy drones that ain't worth a damn. I mean, I'm not saying they're not worth a damn. I'm just saying they're not cost effective. And because your economy is really run on paying out to these huge military contractors, and of course, everyone's hands is in the cookie jar because those military contractor cushy jobs go to former politicians. And this is what happens. The rot and corruption of America is losing to other countries who are like, you know what, we're going to root out corruption because it's bad for the people. But in America, what are our feelings on corruption? Corruption is why we win. Yeah. Corruption keeps us safe and warm. So what do you see? Can you tap into your Muad'Dib tanky I think Trump is in a lot of trouble. I mean, he's going to have to back down from this economic war. But how do you start that, right? But the Chinese did not blink. The Chinese said, you need us more than we need you. We don't have no problem selling to Africa. If we can't sell, first off, we're our own biggest market. It's 1 billion Chinese consumers. So we can sell shit at home first. Only in like 2,000 theaters in America or something like that. And it's still the highest grossing movie ever. Huawei is the largest phone manufacturer in the world. They're leading the industry standard, as I was talking about earlier with, the sixth generation of phones. BYD is the largest car corporation manufacturer in the world. It keeps happening. iSpeed got one. Yeah, see our last episode. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. No. I mean, that's all it is. That's what I'm saying. It's like the Americans believe that the prestige of selling to Americans and Europeans. At the end of the day, the Chinese are about the fucking dollars, man. If they can't sell to Americans and if they can't sell to Europeans, which, by the way, it'll be interesting to see now that Europe is also under tariffs, right? If they continue to do this decoupling with China, because as it stands, it's probably going to be cheaper to do business with China, than it is to do business with the Americans. And gone are the days, right, where Chinese technology is unreliable. They used to say the same thing about the Japanese in the 60s and the 70s, but that shit was gone by the 90s, right? You wanted a Sony, right? Yeah. Everyone's living in the 90s. What are you talking about? These guys are all living in the 90s. They don't want to update. Right. We've been talking about China we're not just us. I mean, I'm just saying we've been having a conversation about China coming a long time ago. We listened to a video from Mike Gravel from like literally the 2002 that was talking about BRICS. And it's just incompetence that the United States, again, is here, racism, not accepting the inevitable truth that this is not going to be a unipolar world. It's going to be a multipolar world. And 1.5 billion people in China is, I mean, we can talk about other countries too, obviously, and is in the mix. But China, China is the one. I mean, they are the counterbalance. And go ahead.
I feel like the one that summed this up the most, and this is why you listen to people, even people you don't like, you listen to them. You got to hear what they think to know how to deal with them, is Putin. Putin said the Americans want to contain China, and they missed that window. He's like, they maybe could have done it 15 years ago, but now trying to contain China is like, literally, this is the quote, is like trying to stop the sun from rising in the sky. It's going to rise every day, no matter what you want to do. Putin was the one that said that, and he's just dead ass right. That's the truth.
Literally trying to give America game. Stop this madness.
Like, don't fucking do this, right?
He's learning about this, Putin. I mean, with the ceasefire, the ridiculousness of the ceasefire, and this, we're not hitting any power facilities, and we break that ceasefire immediately, and just again, the shifty back and forth nature of the
Americans in the West can't be trusted. I mean, and again, right? I leave this to all of the so-called left in the West. You have to start with analysis about America. Whatever you have to say about whatever other country, how they react to the West and how they react to the Americans, you have to ask yourself, why do these countries behave in this way? And if your answer is they're just irrational and mean and evil, you probably have an infantile understanding of geopolitics.
Yo, do you remember when Russia first did the special military operation, and there was a woman who had like a viral video that was like, I wish I was Vladimir Putin's mother. I would have held you I would have made you Cheerios. I would
Liberals
have
are
kissed your
embarrassing.
cheeks.
Yeah. When the average American doesn't even understand before the special military operation, the Russians went to the United Nations and they went into Ukraine actually on a humanitarian look. This is what they said to the United Nations. We're going into Ukraine on a humanitarian mission to preserve the Russian-speaking people who are being slaughtered by their government. They went to the United Nations and said all of this very clearly before they went into Ukraine. And Americans still say the Russians went with no provocation, a total full-scale war. How does a country with nuclear missiles have a full-scale war with a country that doesn't have nuclear? I mean, it's just foolish. Vietnam was not a full-scale war because Saigon would have got fucking nuked. You know, the Korean conflict was not a full-blown war because the Koreans would have got fucking nuked, right? Now, the Americans talked about doing that in both situations, but didn't do it, But no one would really believe these were full-scale wars. At no time was the full weight of the American military machine applied toward Korea, or Korea would not exist. The full weight of the American military applied toward Vietnam, or Vietnam would not exist, because this is what the Americans did in the American frontier against the Native Americans. That's what full war looks like. You know what I'm saying? And we are the best in the world at doing it, But that's not an ethical war, which is to say that any war can be ethical. Total war is the least ethical, and that's the slavery conversation, like with Americans. There was slavery all over the world. Yeah, but shadow slavery was different. It was worse. Full total war is the worst. It means there's no rules. It means the winner won. And America is plenty good at that kind of war. And that's what that kind of war would have to be with China. We wouldn't be able to have a limited engagement. It's whoever goes to fuck hardest is going to get it. And that's how they'll play when it comes to the hot part of the war. And that's why it's up to all of us as activists to work to make sure it never gets there. Because no one wins. The Americans don't win. The Chinese don't win. Humanity doesn't win.
I want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners. We're available everywhere you find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart. Check out our Podbean, our website, innercityleft.com. Like, subscribe, send us a comment. We have a Patreon. Check the bottom of the screen and the description to know more about that. We have a budding community. I've been reading people off the list. The list got too big, which we love. One of them good problems, as Tanky would say. And of course, we put it at the end. We are so appreciative again of Keita and Mike for being on last week. And we have a special guest. Hopefully we'll be able to see Dr. CBS next week. Final thoughts for today. Tanky.
Man, move through the world like you understand that, everybody's always talking about, what I would have done in World War II, what the things out, like how did the people let the Nazis do the things? I mean, now's your big moment.
Yeah. Foremost, your little Tanky Sumler. I'm Amin TMK. It's the Inner City Left broadcast. Peace.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.